computer. Okay, Rhonda,
Okay.
you're up.
Is the slides are up?
Yes, it looks like on my end they're
right. Thank you, Michael. And I see some wonderful familiar faces, so this is great, and I'm looking forward to seeing hopefully y'all at ICA as well. And I want to say hello and good morning. And I'm a morning person, so I'm just going to pretend that that it's morning in Australia. So, so I'll just move along. I hear public diplomacy, but guess what? I think I'm going to focus on human communication because it's going to cross over into public diplomacy, but I think also into what I hear several of y'all were talking about, like development communication, activism, social impact, stratcom, dialogical communication, even like marketing engagement. So I'm gonna, I hope, touch on some of those by focusing more on communication, because I'm looking at how people communicate, but then also how states communicate. And when I started this, and let me start also my timer, I don't want to go over too much. So start. So when I started this, and Michael was telling me about it, I thought, well, wouldn't that be cool to be a PhD student again? And thinking about my PhD, and I do emerging scholars for in public diplomacy. That's how I know Luigi and I think Maggie. And so we present there, and so I'm familiar with that. And then also we have the PhD here, and so I have the book that I just finished, and I said, okay, what if I went through and did that kind of like if it was a dissertation presentation? And I kind of did okay on mine, but I put up the different elements and I thought, okay, well, that would be fun. I'll do that. But then the more I thought about it, no, let me go and tell it more like a backstory on the book. It's going to have all of these elements, the statement of problem, the lit review. What I always look for is a gap in theory. Methodology, I'm really a qualitative person. And then I really love analysis. And so anyway, that was me, really high school, but I had suitcases and that's what I wanted to do, was just to go around. And so what I am going to talk about is do a background on the back of the story. And then really my background before public diplomacy is intercultural communication. And I want to talk about really the limits of culture-based and even nation-based models, and then talk about relationalism, and then relation-based logics, and then the three logics, which is what's been a core of the work that I've been focusing on, and then how to move beyond culture-based and nation-based, and then moving into lenses of separateness and lenses of connectivity. So on my background, I grew up in a bicultural family. My mom and dad out from one side and the planet and the other side of the planet. And they could just look at something and see two things that were completely opposite, which I thought was just the most fascinating thing in the world, how people could see the same object and have such totally different perspectives. And then that took me into intercultural communication. And that was what had been my passion and love. Studied languages, and then I discovered culture, and I just was fascinated by that, just human diversity. And so I was really into human diversity and cultural diversity, and then 9/11 happened. And so instead of looking, I just shifted focus from diversity of how people see to diversity of how countries and nations, when they try to communicate on the global stage. And so, of course, the US went all out, and they were focused on the Islamic world. And that's what I had been writing on, was the Arab and Islamic culture. And so I was called to testify before Congress. That was a whole another nightmare. And I did before Joe Biden. I did it before the Senate, a week before the US went into the Iraq. So I was focused on how the US was communicating with the Arab world. And then they said the Islamic world, which like 1.5 billion people. It's like, okay, that's a cool audience. And it was just a mess. The very same audience the US was trying to reach was the very same they were alienating. And so everybody was, and the reason I was called was like, what's going on here? And I was like, well, what's going on here? And then that's where I started shifting to study a relational and network approach. So maybe it was the approach that the US was using. And so that's how I got into relational and network models of public diplomacy. But then the more I was looking at it, is that realizing that it was more than just approach, because the US kept switching its approach. If it could just get the different style, it would be able to communicate. And people would say, well, wait a second. And this is where I got really chewed out at the Senate in Congress was, it's policy, it's policy. Well, yes, it is policy, but the whole idea of communication and public diplomacy was to present policy. So yes, policy was a factor, but communication was supposed to get over that hurdle. And then that really got me thinking, well, what's going on here even deeper? And then that's when I saw that really public diplomacy was kind of a window into looking at communication, global communication, not through the lens of scholars, but through the lens of real-time communication. Because I saw that public diplomacy, when looking at it, it kind of evolved. Nations were communicating with publics, and for the first time, publics were able to communicate. So it was like this real-time window of states communicating and publics communicating back. And so when I saw that that communication was fundamentally important, but that there were really fundamental differences in understanding communication. And I began to question my own, like I've been studying communication and teaching communication, and all of a sudden I'm re-examining everything that I thought I knew about communication. And so that's when I started on this other journey of globalizing public diplomacies and trying to answer this question of what is public diplomacy. And then to add it to all the other stuff, there was the global problems. And public diplomacy and strategic diplomacy was focused on national goals. And I'm like, wait a second, the world's on fire, or it's being flooded, or then there's a global pandemic. And I wrote about a global pandemic, and this was for the Hague Journal of Diplomacy and their special issue. And I put that there was a global pandemic, and they called it hyperbole. This was 2 years before the global pandemic. And I said, guys, we've got to shift focus to the really bigger problems than states, than state mandates. There's really a global mandate for public diplomacy. And I got chewed out royally, and I had to revamp everything. But I was able to get humanity-centered public diplomacy. But that's where that piece really started questioning, where are we going with our global communication? So, and also what was fascinating is that these global problems demanded diversity. because if they're looking at a complex, wicked problem, if everybody's looking at it from the same angle, they're going to have the same types of approaches, the same types of perspective and problem solving. So diversity was key to attacking or unraveling some of these global problems. And I put a Wikipedia over there because that's just an example of the global, when global perspectives are focused on problems. So I get excited just thinking about all of this stuff. So I went back to all of my books, and I've got like 9 bookcases on global, I'm sorry, on intercultural communication, because that was my field. And I'm so over messages and everything, like what is going on? And I have all the books. I tore my books apart. And this was, Hall is my favorite. And I do know, I got to meet Professor Hall when I was, well, I'd gotten my PhD, but I was invited to the symposium, and I got to go on these afternoon walks with Professor Hall, and just really, I just love his work. And that was my mentor and idol. And I still have a lot of his thinking in my work, just an inspiration. And then Hofstadter, I met Hofstadter in Malta at a conference there, and him presenting, and his is really state-based. And that, I've been toying with that one, and trying to move away from state-based that got morphed into culture. So I went back and started looking at all these intercultural models, and they're presented as continuums, like individualism and collectivism. It's supposed to be this continuum. But what happens is, or what I was noticing, and what is all in the literature, is they become opposites, mutually exclusive. You're either individualist or you're collectivist, which is like, you know, it kind of makes sense, except humans aren't that simple. And this, this was a wonderful video I was watching just to prep for this. And because I needed a graphic. And so I was looking at this, they're all over the place, individualism versus collectivism. But in just watching this video, it says, here's an individualist. It says that sometimes the individualist has to say goodbye to the collective in order to pursue their dreams. And that's what individualists do. And I'm like, well, excuse me. I think there's a lot of collectivists, but maybe they, you know, it would be leaving to pursue the collectivist dream. Then the one that I really love is that in that collectivist societies, collectivist cultures make very stark differences between in-groups and out-groups. Hello, this is the US border and building a wall. And there's a sharp difference between in-groups and out-groups that individualist cultures don't do. Those are what collectivist cultures do. And so we only have to see the immigrant debates that's going on in the walls that are going up. So the intercultural models, just a lot of inconsistencies, and this has been put in this is well documented in the literature. So that was the intercultural models, a lot of inconsistencies and limitations. But then on the other side of the coin, there are cultural and specific models. And these, I just love these. And this is what a lot of I used in my research, drawing especially on Gumin Chen, and then really Mickey. And I loved his work of not learning about cultures, but learning from cultures. And then studying the different, not really models, but more perspectives. But the problem I was having with the culture specific models is that they were exactly culture specific. It was about China or Asia and not really applying to other peoples or humans and the human family. And so I was trying to think, okay, there's got to be some parallels in there. There's got to be some applications. And that was one of the things that I found in my research that was just incredibly fascinating, that concepts such as individualism that would be in the US was also finding it in Confucianism. And that Trandis wrote that when he was studying Confucianism and collectivist culture, he found so many aspects of individualism. And then when I was studying the Greeks, finding the concepts of harmony, that it was foundational in a lot of the Greek literature, the ancient Greek literature. So this was something that was really fascinating when I was doing the relation. So what I did was, when I was having all these problems with the models, intercultural models, I went back and I said I got tons and tons of material. I started just looking at the literature again. When the scholars or the writers were writing about communication, what were they really writing about, or what were they talking about? And I kept coming across relations. And then I stumbled across this concept of relationalism. And then I found it in the Eastern literature, and I found it in Western literature. I found it in sociology, social psychology. I found it in political science. That was in the West. And then it was in a lot in the Asian literature. And what it is it's really a lens for looking closely at relational dimensions, dynamics, context, processes, and structure. I really love this by a South African writer who talked about learning to read the interconnectedness, and not in terms of networks, because when I'll tell you, I'll go through later, when we get into spheres and nodes, you can't trace the connections. So it was relation. So I took this lens of relationalism, and I went back and I did a global trek. I started with literature, Western literature, and then that was close to the US. I did the US, individualism, and then I looked at Europe, and then I moved into Africa. I went to Asia. I went to Latin America. And I did West and non-Western. And so I just was looking for themes and patterns. And this was, Maureen, I thank you, bless you. You were the reviewer on this that I didn't know about until I got into trouble on something. But this was a piece that I did for Com Theory. And just I was looking at different relational assumptions, and this is a piece that's out there. It's Beyond Individualism, Collectivism, and Divide, and looking at relationalism, and it was looking at relational assumptions, and just the idea of relations. We think that we know what we're talking about, but when I looked at all the different, when I was looking at all the different literature. Just finding different assumptions. For example, one is building relations, but then others see relations as they use communication and relationships interchangeably. And that's just in the European literature. And then moving into others to relational being. And that was a basis for the book. So what comes next is, after finding these relational assumptions, looking and seeing relational patterns. And what first came up was, of course, the individualism. The basic there's one relational pattern is the individualism, that just focus on separateness, the separate individual, and then the other. Then I noticed there's another pattern that was very prominent, was the dyadic pair. And then a third is the relational universe. And in the Western literature, there is the individual and then the collectivism. the relational dyadic pair wasn't even there. And one thing that I noticed too, and let me see if this comes up, is that when I went back and looked at this thing of called communication and intercultural communication, I noticed that it appeared to be a template, that there's the sender and receiver. And when it got to the collectivist, it wasn't really a worldview. It was just plugged into this template. And so this template was the sender receiver. And then if it was a collectivist, it was just really modifying the approach or style, but it still was this template of something that you send. And you just modified it and made it a relational approach. And you made it more relational language, or you made it more relational interactive or engagements, but it was still kept this basic sender receiver model that was completely different from what the other scholars were talking about. And that was what I was trying to get at. What was the other? So that's where I went back and then said, okay, identified like these three logics. What did communication look like? Let me go back here. What did communication look like from an individual perspective? And that's real prominent in the literature. But then what would communication look like if people are joined? I don't have to send anything anymore. So there must be a very different logic. Then what would communication look like if it wasn't just the 1+1 or the paired relation? What would communication look like if I was in a relational universe? And I wasn't about sending. It wasn't about being connected. It was something bigger and larger. And I know the relational because, well, if just from the Middle East, there's an intense relation. My husband's also from the Middle East, but he'd also studied in China and lived in China for about a decade. And I was talking about him, it's like the relations seem very, very different. So I knew that communication, there was a whole difference there, but it was different than the collectivist model. So I was trying to find ways to articulate and get to it. So what I did for the book was I went back, it's like, okay, if these were pan-human models, they must be in the ancient world as well. And so that's where I went back and tried to look at these ideas, these logics in ancient society, because I could see them in the contemporary, but I wanted to go back to ancient. So I went back and I went back in Aristotle's rhetoric, and used the rhetoric to talk about the individual logic. And rhetoric was everywhere in Western logic, Western communication literature. And so no surprise that for the individual logic, there is the communicator and speech, verbalizing, the need to verbalize, and the prominent dynamics was attributes, individual attributes and agency, messages, medium, audience. There was the goal orientation and measurability. And I put it was the individual expressive logic because expressive was a communication imperative because the individual is separate. The only way to be known by others is to express. The only way to create and build relations was through speech and communicating. And that was the individual logic. The relational logic, and this I went back to Amarna diplomacy. This was ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and there was a brotherhood of 5 kings. And Western diplomatic scholars look at it through the Armana letters, because again, it's speech and the assumption that everybody's separate. They focused on the correspondence. I went back and looked at the relational elements. And what was prominent was that communication was not about speech or delivering messages. It was a relational bond. That communication, when you say communication, communication was shaped by the bond, a strong bond, strong communication, strained bond, strained communication, emotion, how you felt about someone. And we know this from, like, we can think about our significant others. And so if if there was a communication problem, it was a relational problem. And what was a pivotal, whereas speech may have been important in the individual logic, emotion was a critical element in the relational logic. And that's what I put there. Instead of focusing on message is there, of course, but in the relational logic, it's contact points. It's that opportunity to connect. And I put here nonverbal, but it's really co-presence. It's being able to see and be emotion. And I go more into this thing that was fascinating for me. I went into neuroscience, that the role of emotion, it's just amazing, the efficiency of emotion in communication, that it's very efficient. And I went back into the primitive brain. And so I was just, I'm going to go off on a tangent, won't go there. So perspective taking, and then reciprocity, and then symbolism, these elements of communication that are overlooked or are not studied, or are studied through the lens of verbal discourse. So I'm going to have to get some water here. So then the third logic was the relational logic. I'm sorry, the holistic logic. This took me, I would say, about 6 or 7 years to really kind of understand and unravel. I kind of felt I knew, of course, from my Western training, I understood the individual logic. I knew from the Middle East, or from this intense relational logic. Holistic logic took me unraveling that was a bit. And I kind of unraveled that, and then trying to articulate that. And again, I said, okay, this has got to be in the ancient world. And so here I went back to the cosmos, which fit because the holistic logic is about the relational universe. And so I went back to the ancient world, and how did they explain the cosmos? How did they explain the universe? And here I went back to the cosmograms. They drew pictures on walls and etched in stones or created. And this is the goddess Mat of Kismet in ancient Egypt. And there's a feather on her head. But what was fascinating about how the ancients described the universe, or the founding of the universe, in Hindu, in Greeks, in Egypt, in Mesoamerica, in China, they talk about chaos. The founding of the universe was all about chaos. And then you have some force or a goddess or some being that brings order and harmony. And what was interesting, it was funny. It was in all the ancient worlds. They talk about chaos, and then bringing harmony. The Greeks, well, the thing was, they had different realms. There was the physical realm, the spiritual realm, and the social realms. And these crazy human beings, these humanoids, they would get into trouble, and then the gods in the spiritual realm would invoke, and there would be some type of natural disaster that would bring them all back into good behavior. And then this was just the Egyptians. That feather on top of her head was that this is how you kept the humans in order. They all had to behave, but these realms were all interconnected. And it was the Greeks that separated. They got tired of the whims of the gods, and so they separated the realms. But the other ancient cosmos, the other ancient societies kept these interconnected realms. And what's interesting is the spiritual is the realm of the unseen. And the way today that we think of the digital and all being connected, the holistic is wonderful because they just assume this interconnectivity. And so this is what's fascinating. I love the holistic logic. There's this relational universe, and the focus here, not speech or emotion, but connectivity and interaction. This is really the dynamo here. And so looking at this logic, some of the elements of the dynamics here, I'm just going to go through them because this was what was fascinating to me, because I kept studying these cosmograms, trying to find these different elements. One, expanding relations. And this is that in this relational universe, relations overlap. They expand, and as they expand, they overlap and interpenetrate. So this is a phenomena of expanding relations. And this is from Faye, and Faye talks about expanding relationships. And Shuishu, my Chinese not that good, is interpenetrating. Another element is context sensitivity. This is the Aztec sun. And you can see all of just the amazing detail of this interconnectivity of contextual sensitivity. It's in a relational universe. It's learning about all the interconnectivity of different elements. And that's where I got the sunstone of this connect of the different elements and knowing the context. This is another Uzbekistan Mandala. And what I love about this mandala is it really shows the interconnectivity of the unseen realm. Because if you look at the network, I love the networks, when they do network analysis, all the nodes are connected. And that's great if you're dealing with the seen realm or the known realm. But in a relational universe, things are connected where you cannot trace the connection. And this, if you look at this mandala, it looks like they're all connected, but if you actually trace them, they don't connect. They don't connect. They're connected, but don't connect. Another thing that was in the literature was preserving diversity. In a relational universe, preserving diversity is absolutely critical, because that's how the relational universe maintains its longevity, is through diversity. And an example of this was like, okay, how am I going to explain this one? And I found the Sri Yantra. And this is, again, all of these cosmograms were drawings of how the ancients tried to explain the universe or try to capture an element. And here the diversity here is in the triangles. They're called triangles, sorry, triangles. So we have the triangles. The male upward triangles is male energy, downward is female energy. And so if I did my individual logic, what I would do is I would switch them all. Since the female is the dominant one, I would change all the diagram, all the triangles, and make them downward. And if I did that, and then I'd have just 9 triangles. If I take four male triangles and 5 female triangles, I get 9 triangles, that's what happens with the individual logic. Because I need diversity, if I keep that diversity, I get synergy. And if I overlap them, instead of 9 triangles, we actually went and counted. I have my assistant count, we get 43 triangles. And this is the synergy of preserving diversity, which is what the ancients talk about, and which is also was in the literature when I pulled in all of the holistic literature. This was preserving diversity was absolutely key to the synergy. Another thing that was in that I kept coming across was mutual adaptation, and then also change in continuity. And this illustrate this, looking again at the I Ching or the yin yang, the wavy line captured that mutual adaptation, because I found with some of the yin yang models, they showed how the black would it would take over and there were it was different portionalities. It wasn't this nice, neat portionality. It would go up in different elements. And then I thought about, okay, again, the individual logic or a different way of looking at it would have just been the straight black and white. But to show change, we have that waving, and also the change in the wavy shows adaptation, but it also shows that change in continuity. So, and then how to do the cooperative. I found this was the yin yang, and this comes from the ancient medicine of that it was the lines that were drawn. And if you draw those lines, this was from a medical textbook, and this was for meridians, but if you're drawing the lines, yang is in yang and yang is in yin. And so this was the element of cooperation, that there was a shared fate. So, of course, I do a better job, I think, in the book of doing that. But anyway, so these were the holistic, individual, and relational logic. And the thing that I want to stress is that they're not mutually exclusive. They're not categories. They're not overlapping. They're found, if we look, I think that most of us know the importance of speech to communication, and that's the individual logic. At the same time, we know the importance of emotion in communication, and that's the relational logic. One does not exclude or exclude the other. They're both critical. We know the importance of interaction, or I would say embodied communication. It's absolutely critical in human communication. So it's not they're not these categories. They're not overlapping. They're not exclusive to one geocultural region or national. So that's what they're, and they're, instead of nation-based or culture-based, I want to say they're relations-based. They're based on different relational premises. And these relationships are just, they're panhumic, individual. We name individuals. It's this basic human practice of giving individuals names that make them unique. But this uniqueness can be individuality. It doesn't have to be separate. In fact, some get their individual identity through relations. The relational, the institution of marriage is that dyadic relational bond. And then the holistic, just the societies. So they're coexisting. And I want to say that we've really, really focused. We've got that individual logic down good. Now I think how do we explore communication from different logics? And that's what I'm really excited about. So where are we? So looking at the digital's bringing it all back. That's what I'm so excited about too, and this is what I'm working on now, is a lens of separateness and a lens of connectivity, and seeing a blurring of the categories and a fading of these geo-cultural categories. So, and also looking at social media in terms of relations-based communication. And seeing also how relational aspects like emojis, how they're there, and then this interconnectivity. And I know I blurred a lot of stuff. So what else? So I'm doing these state-centric, the lens of, I'm moving away from I've moved away from state-centric public diplomacy and really looking at humanity-centered. How do we deal with global complex problems? And being more process-oriented. And so it's human-centered, looking at how to, again, moving away from strategic communication to looking at mediating identities. How do we respond? Luigi, I was talking about, really want to do something on empathetic public diplomacy. We saw this with the British monarch when that was that early stages of the pandemic. The British monarch gave a speech to the Commonwealth, and it was really about empathetic communication, reaching out and responding to emotion. It wasn't delivering a message so much as an emotional connective. So looking at emotion in terms of connectivity instead of persuasion. And then the whole thing of problem solving. How do we look at communication as problem solving? So I said I was going to do like dissertation, from dissertation to book. For those that are doing, getting over that dissertation hump, this is a book that's been recommended from dissertation to book. So thank you. That's me. That's what I've been working on. And so now it's now 9 o'clock and I'm still awake. Let me see if I can stay awake for about another half hour. So, and I don't know why my room is awfully hot in here, but let's see what we got here.
Okay. Does anybody want to start up with a question?
I have one, if I can go. Thank you so much, Rhonda. Really enjoyed it. I was wondering if you would talk to theories of globalization and the implications that they might have for your model. And here I'm sort of thinking about how, as an undergraduate, I remember we used to read about the death of the nation state, for instance, and globalization was doing away with that, with global interconnectivity. And then 9/11 happened, and then a number of geopolitical events have happened since then. And we're definitely living in a time now of a resurgent nation state. And we saw that with, particularly from an Australian perspective, with hard borders shut and, restricted international movements and that sort of stuff. So to what extent do you feel that might contradict, this more move to away from nation states and embracing the holistic. Does it, or what am I not seeing there?
Okay, no, you're definitely seeing, and I'm going to find out how to. I should put it in the chat. And I really get, you guys are comm scholars. You should see what the diplomacy scholars do to me. I get really shot through holes. Like, what do you mean the state? The state is like, that's the foundation of the international system. What do you mean? And the thing is, the state's not going away. The state's there, the state's going to be there. But at the same time, and this is, I'm going to see, I should put in the chat, and I can put here, I want to say IRYIE. Yes. And he writes about the global community, and he's looking at the international NGOs. And he said, and this was before the 1900s, there was only like 5 international NGOs. Now it's gone to 14. It went to 14,000, up even to 48,000. And he said the states have been commanding the world attention on the global stage, but behind the stage, you've had this steady rise of international NGOs. We've also seen the rise of civil society. So this is really where I think now my work has been going at. How can I, and that's what I put the boundary spanners, because I've made a really deliberate attempt, like the states are on the world stage and they're commanding attention, and they're going to continue to command attention. I really wanted to address those that are working in other areas, because intercultural communication, I wanted to move away from dividing people into cultural categories and national categories, and try to find some elements. So when I was reading about the Asian scholars and they would talk about a concept, I wanted to say, okay, how can I translate that concept into something that would be accessible to others that may not be familiar with this idea of emotion, or the importance of relational being, that I don't have to create relations. I'm already in a relation. So does that make sense? Yeah.
Okay, somebody else?
I know I put out a lot. Is it too off the wall, guys? Is it too off the wall, or too idealistic, or too?
Maybe I have a question. In terms of you're talking about emotion and connectivity. So when we talk about emotions, emotions can bring us together, both in positive and negative way. We can we can hate together. We can also love together. So I was wondering, how these duality can plays in your module, and can also emotion take us apart as well. So, and how we'll deal with this with division, and I guess it's also related to the war, the current war in Ukraine, but also all the polarization in the political debate, within democratic debate, and so on. So how do we deal with these emotions that take us apart? I guess it's a huge question, but yeah.
See, I want to say it's an assumption that we think that relations are positive. Not all relations are negative. I mean, not all relations are positive. But the individual logic thinks the only way I would have a relation is if it's positive, or that emotions are going to be positive in order for me to connect. In the relational logic, you're just there, you're connected. So studying relations, negative emotion is absolutely critical. And that's what I was trying to do is, why are we studying emotion only in terms of persuasion? How is emotion in communication? And if we even look at, and so why would we assume that emotion is positive? Love. It's just the whole idea of focusing on emotion as an element, as a pivotal element of communication, the same way we focus on speech as a pivotal element of communication. Why are we focused on words? Why are we discourse? Why dialogue? And that's speech. Why? That's the whole, that's what I was, because speech can be negative or positive. Emotion can be negative or positive. Interconnectivity can have a negative or positive. It's the whole idea of looking at these very fundamental elements. And that's what I was trying to bring attention to. Why are there 7 sections of public speaking being taught and none on listening, or none on nonverbal, or even on interpersonal? Yeah.
I took classes on nonverbal listening when I was.
I did. I used to teach it.
So it's just not here in Australia, I don't think, but it does go on.
Mm-hmm. So, but to bring those elements back, and if you look at, and this is why I think, if you look at a lot of the, not a lot, but I'm thinking of the, oh gosh, I'm going to say now, the truth, these propaganda things that's coming up. It's focusing on content, and really there's just a huge emotional element. Mm-hmm. Some of the hate speech that's going on, it's not the words per se, there's an underlying relational connectedness. And again, that's the relational logic. It's not so much what they're saying, what they're saying, it's that I identify emotionally with the person. The anger, I identify with the anger. I identify with or maybe a superiority.
I liked the visual depictions too that you bring in, because I think it sort of illustrates how these collectivist cultures are seeing things, that I think aren't really appreciated by the individualistic culture. Like if you look at Christian art, there's, good and bad, up and down, God and the devil, hell and heaven. And, the line is, there's no.
And also the Madonna, the focus on the individual. That takes up the center stage.
Yeah, so it just is interesting when we start looking at those Aztec drawings and those models and, things etched in stone, essentially representations of how they see the world that they never thought about, right? I mean, they didn't say, oh yes, this is how we see the world. That's how they saw the world. They drew it, just like a Christian artist draws something and says, this is how we see the world, just assuming that everyone sees it the same way.
Mm-hmm. And then the thing is, instead of learning about them, what can communication scholars learn from them, and not plugging it back into, okay, well, this is how I can send a message better or design a more strategic communication. It's how can I adopt that, see communication from a different logic.
Well, you brought Hall up too in the beginning, and I like that because I think Hall is much more open-minded and about how he thinks about communication. It's not simply black and white and categories, philosophical pairs. It's much more of a continuum.
And what I'm really going toward now is synchrony. he has a whole thing in Beyond Culture on Synchrony. And that was where that's where I got a lot of my material for the holistic logic. That we move in Synchrony. And it was really Kim who did an amazing piece, and she's an intercultural scholar on Synchrony. And how just moving in sync with others is a form of communication. And that's what Hall said. He said it was one of the most basic forms of communication. And when we get into intercultural, he said one of the first things he does when he goes to a different society, and that's what I'd like to do, a different society or different cultural setting, is to get into the rhythm, to find the rhythm and pace of how people are moving. So,
What
and
is
military training.
What is Hall's first name? Mitchell was asking, and I forget.
Edward
Edward.
T. Hall.
Yeah.
Edward T. Hall. And his wife was Mildred. So yes.
May I ask a
Gosh,
question? Sorry.
Please.
Thank you so much. The way you told the story of how your idea evolved by looking at like diverse sources was very, very engaging. I'm wondering why emotion and not our orientation towards other. For example, in the Persian literature, they talk a lot about human essence, how this human essence is shared among all people, and how this human essence connects people together. And so in an ultimate state, there is no other, but we are all the same. So this connectivity creates positive relationship. But when we see others as different, separated individuals from us, it creates a negative relationship. So why emotion and not our orientation towards others?
Well, where do you get your orientation toward others? It's how you feel.
Like, for example, when like in an interpersonal relationship, when I'm talking to a person and I feel that that person is a very different person, a different entity, a very different entity with different benefits, with different interests and needs. And sometimes if I feel that our benefits might be mutually exclusive, I feel this disconnectedness. Does it make sense? I don't know.
That makes a lot of sense, but that's the whole point. It's making a lot of cognitive sense. The reason I picked emotion, you're like rationalizing, can I get the benefit, or they're different from me? The reason I picked emotion is because of neuroscience as well. Because we know instinctively, or we know lay term, that when we meet somebody, we can kind of get a sense of, do we like the person or not like the person, and how that emotional feeling kind of shapes our communication with them. We will sit there and make more conversation and want to know more about them, or they do something and it's like, well, I don't really like these people. And it kind of gets that kind of thing. So we have that. So I'm like, where's that coming from? And then I went and looked at neuroscience. We have in the stomach, the abdominal region, there's a second brain, and there are more neurons there than in the spine. And it's when we have this, the Japanese say belly logic. In the English, it's a gut feeling. I have a gut feeling about somebody. That's emotion. The thing of what's so amazing about emotion is how efficient it is in communication. There is, this is where I put in the limbic system has no capacity for language. When we are afraid, we pull back. When we like, we go forward. And it goes on these two things of approach good, approach, feel bad, avoid. And this is emotion. And this is just a very efficient communication. And that's what I put in the relation. This is the relational logic where what if words didn't exist? Let's say that suppose the West wasn't the big dominant in communication. What if the field of communication had originated, I want to say, in the Middle East or Persia? What would it look like? What would we be studying? And we would be language for sure, but were other language besides would we have audience or these kind of things? I do remember, I think it was McNamara, that the words were the bread and butter of communication. We study rhetoric, language, words. In other cultures or societies, it's actions. And there's even the expression, actions speak louder than words. And that's the whole thing of holistics. It's saying, let's look at communication from another language, another angle. And that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about translating. I'm talking about let's look at communication from a different angle entirely.
Right. Like actually, I try to help in teaching cross-cultural. When I'm trying to explain collectivism to students, I try to tell them that, when you're in that culture, you don't see it as an individualist saying, oh, why do I have to do these things? This sucks, like I only care about me. You behave a certain way because that's how your culture works. You don't think about it and say, you don't get annoyed that the other person has higher status or that the other person has more than you do. You accept that depending on the culture, there's a hierarchy and here's where I am. So just there's this very different view of things, which I think is an interesting way of looking at it, because we have people often wanting to look at public relations in different countries, public relations in India, public relations in China, public relations in UAE, public relations in whatever, and they usually don't have a good reason for why they want to look at those countries. Why are we looking at communication in whatever? But I think this gives some justification for it, is that understanding the difference between how people see the world and how that influences their communication.
I think the reason I want to do like the three logics together is because I was just talking with a thing. This was someone from Ukraine and a PhD student. And I put the three logics and he said, yes, because my parents were into the communist. And so they had this perspective. I have this perspective, and now I'm seeing my younger brother, who's like 8 years younger than I am. Has this perspective, and that's the whole thing, is we can see different selves, aspects, and these different logics. I talked to one of my other students and teaching in China, and he said, and he teaches intercultural communication. He said his students all say they're individualists. They don't see themselves as collectivists. So, and that was one thing about the collectivist, is it was this impersonal. It was like the individualist has a lot of personality, but the collectivist is just this collective. And it's kind of like the individual is this bounded whole, and seeing the collectivist as this bounded whole, and they do this and they did, it's like that. And so that's where I wanted to break that apart. So, but the whole thing is just, I just want to see different elements of, I just want to study something besides messages. Oh, which is, by the way, I'm moving away from strategic communication to consensus communication, because the strategic, it comes the rhetoric and the Greeks. And this was Kennedy, who did a global analysis of rhetoric. And he said what was unique about the Greek rhetoric, it was very contentious. And it was based on this,
Litigation. A lot of it about litigation in courts of law.
but contentious in that you only needed one more vote on the Democratic thing. You only needed one more. So you could get into really cutting edge and I can't remember Eric, but if there was a problem, you jumped in the boat and go to the other island. He said other societies had more of a tradition of consensus. And this is also, I want to say, in the Middle East, your neighbor's not going anywhere. They're not going anywhere. And so you've got to figure out a way to build a consensus. And the whole idea of trying to build up one party against another party, it's a very difficult thing. So really moving toward why are we studying strategic communication? And so I'm looking at consensus communication. So yeah, I'm looking at lots of other different things.
All right.
Which is, yeah, once you get your PhD, you can do.
Just a comment, I wrote a piece on military PR and I got into the origins of the word strategy, and it is all coming from the military. We attack public opinion in a very one way, and the word tactics that we keep using in PR, it is propaganda, not PR. It is trying to persuade in a very organization-centered approach. So
that's vis-a-vis other organizations. You know, it was so interesting. It was George in the Netherlands and introduced the thing of military drills. And they found that if they could get people to march in step and do vocalization in step, they created very effective and efficient units. And it was that synergy that was a form of communication that's created that bonding of military troops. And then that spread throughout Europe. That was, so it's all, and that's consensus communication, synchrony, fascinating. Thank you.
When I wrote my writing book, I tried to use no war or sports metaphors. So I tried to use cooking metaphors whenever I had to create an example of something, you know, because I really think that the way we construct these, you know, our language constructs how we think about things.
Good. So since I stumped all on that, so the way of doing collaboration, speech, collaborating through storytelling. It's creating bonds and connection through storytelling. Emotion, I'm trying to think, empathy. Making through empathy. And what was fascinating, interactivity was synchrony. That's another thing I want to study much more on is synchrony. How verbal and nonverbal synchrony, as Hall said, was a form of communication. And he looked at autism. Infants as young as I don't know, I think it was like 3 days old, were able to synchronize their body movements with adult speech. And we do it automatically. We kind of sync with the other. We try to get in sync. And so
Yeah, we do that non-verbally when we communicate with people, not interpersonally. Yeah. You taught that, you know.
yeah,
Okay.
I am gonna be.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I get off at 9:30. Can I get off at 9:30? My time.
Nobody else has a question. Let's wrap it up since it's late for you.
It's late, but it's morning in Sydney, so I'm good.
Okay, well, let me stop the recording here. So if anybody wants to ask anything secret, hold on. Stop recording.